This is Regenerative Skills, the podcast helping you to learn the skills and solutions to create an abundant and connected future. I'm your host, Oliver Gaucher. Through their diverse range of publications, New Society Publishers' books explore topics that are at the forefront of creating positive change in our world. From regenerative agriculture and permaculture to social justice and eco-conscious living, their books cover a wide spectrum of subjects that empower readers to lead more regenerative and fulfilling lives. Now, whether you're a seasoned environmentalist, a curious beginner, or someone simply seeking inspiration and guidance on your journey towards regenerative living, New Society Publishers is here to support you every step of the way. Now exclusively for listeners of this podcast, you can use the code SKILLS25 and receive a 25% discount on all ebooks at newsociety.com. That's all one word and lowercase, SKILLS25 on all ebooks. So level up your knowledge today at newsociety.com. Hey there everybody and welcome back. So today I want to start a fun new series on a topic that I've wanted to explore for quite a while, which is the concept of regenerative education. Now, I've worked as a teacher and an educational facilitator in different capacities since the beginning of my career. First in before and after school programs for kids, then as an arts and environmental educator at summer camps, then English as a second language in both South Korea and Guatemala, and in between teaching various technical workshops in natural building and permaculture, ecosystem restoration, the transition journey to regenerative agriculture, and of course, water management and water cycle restoration. Now, every time that I engage in these activities, I gain huge respect for teachers and their incredible skill and patience that it takes to be an effective educational facilitator. And similarly, I also want to continue to grow as a teacher and even improve my skills as a student, since I'm also always in some sort of course or another at the same time. Now, I know that this is a wide and nuanced topic, and so to help me to become oriented to the considerations and the scope of what I'm exploring, I reached out to Pavel Cenkl, who is the academic dean at Prescott College in Arizona and the founder of the Regenerative Learning Network. His work focuses on the intersection of transformative learning, community and ecology, and building a more regenerative, resilient, and equitable educational future. He's also the author of several books, including Transformative Learning with Satish Kumar, Relational Ecologies, Building Regenerative Community Learning Networks, In Regenerative Ecosystems in the Anthropocene, and Lessons from the Periphery in Regenerative Learning. Pavel's current book in progress is titled Networked Learning, Transforming Higher Education Through Distributed Learning. Now, this conversation weaves from the troubles with traditional or conventional educational models and why they leave so many people behind and increasingly in debt, through alternative models of teaching and the potential that educational institutions really have. We explore the role of technology in learning as well as the things that the digital world can't replace. And Pavel also gives his take on what makes effective educators and a window into their process of creating learning curriculums that are in line with the concept of regenerative education. Now, this is the first in a series of interviews that I'm in the process of planning. So if you have any ideas about what questions I should explore or who I should speak to in upcoming interviews, I would encourage you to reach out to me through the Regenerative Skills Discord server. And thanks to my friends at New Society Publishers, I'm also offering a book giveaway for Pavel and Satish Kumar's title, Transformative Learning. And all you have to do to be eligible to win a copy is to message me through the Discord server, which you can sign up to for free through the homepage on our website at regenerativeskills.com or through the link in our bio on Instagram. And I'll announce the winners 1 week after the release of this episode, so be sure to get in touch quickly. Now, with all of that out of the way, I will hand things over now to Pavel Cenkl. Well, welcome, Pavel. I'm really excited to speak to you today. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well, Oliver. It's great to join you here. Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Now, we have so much that we can cover on this extremely broad topic of regenerative education. But to get us started, could you tell our listeners how you got started in this field?
Oh my goodness. Well, it's a long story, I think, just as all of these are. And, I'll say, so I'm the Dean of Academic Affairs here at Prescott College at the moment. And I've just about completed my first year here and arrived here after being about 4.5 years in England as head of Schumacher College, which was there. And then previously, about 13 years at Sterling College in Vermont, being various flavors of dean at Sterling. And, what those three institutions have in common, I think, is part of the answer to that question, right? That they're all relatively small, really progressive institutions which operate at the intersection of more than human and human communities, with a real focus on community learning, on social justice, on integrating experiential and practice-led learning into the core of the educational and pedagogical paradigm, right? And whether that's through curriculum development or whether it's actually what happens in the classroom and with the students. So, examples of that are, Sterling College is a work college. So one of the, I think, 9 now federally recognized work colleges where all students work as part of the academic curriculum. And whether that's on the farm, in the kitchen, in the admissions office, or in the finance office, the practice and engagement of meaningful labor in support of a community is an integrated part of that experience. And similar at Schumacher College, when I was there in sort of low residency master's programs, master's students in regenerative economics would spend time in the gardens, weeding and working alongside the garden team, and helping to prepare the food and eat the food together and so on. So focused really around the pedagogy of shared experience as one way to enter into deeper conversations about what the particular subject matter was. And here at Prescott, quite similarly, experiential learning is absolutely at the core of every element of what we do. And whether that's some of our remote graduate programs coming in residency, here on campus in Arizona, or one of our field campuses in Mexico or Kenya or elsewhere. And certainly for example, our undergraduate students now are on a 21-day wilderness orientation, those that arrived in early January. So beginning with that experience and beginning with that practice, connecting the human with the more than human is the foundation, and I think really fundamental to the meaningful work that I've been part of at any one of those three institutions.
And all three of these institutions really have reputations for breaking the mold as far as most college or university curriculums. And I actually remember looking into each of them when I was considering going to some higher learning. What is it that makes them so different beyond, a curriculum and its core that people would really recognize as progressive, like you mentioned, as being different from what we normally associate with either higher education or what we grew up with in conventional schooling?
Well, I think part of that answer is, manifested itself in the current crisis that we have in higher education, right? I mean, you're probably familiar from your own research that, a month doesn't go by without another institution closing as a result of the relatively unfavorable economic, bureaucratic, political, neoliberal system that, small progressive institutions try to try to make a way for themselves in. And that's, really unfortunate because, a lot of those are, I think, at the vanguard of what higher education can be. Most recently, we partnered with Goddard College, which closed this past year, one of the leading and older progressive institutions in Vermont. And we're fortunate to be able to serve their students coming on board. Similarly, we had a relationship with Green Mountain College when they closed a few years ago, Quest University when they closed, but the list goes on, right? And I think what that suggests, one, is that it's really difficult in higher education, to run a college of any sort. But I think particularly outside the framework of a more, shall we call it, sort of monolithic, institutional framework, where a large university can have departments that open and close based on economic factors, that can address, some of the issues that we cover here, right? Some of the same curricular areas, whether it's sustainable food systems or experiential learning or social justice. But I think that the distinction that I see, both with Sterling, Schumacher, and Prescott, and sort of a larger institution, is we have I don't want to sound disparaging to other universities, right? But we have the capacity to be authentic in our experiential engagement in ways that potentially a larger institution does not have, right? Scale helps with that, right? We're able to cultivate, I think right now we have about 900 students across our residential and remote programs. So we have the capacity to cultivate those deeper relationships between faculty and students and across student groups that may not be possible if you've got 10 or 20,000 students. That's one thing, right? And another is, I think, our connections to community partners, our connection to actual network of similar institutions across the globe that, try to foster this, real depth of relationship between the human and the more than human. And I think, there are two pieces there that, we can explore a bit further. One is that idea of, we are part of really a distributed learning model where our students, whether they're remote or here, have capacity to connect with experiential practices wherever they might be. And secondly, we have sort of complementary partners that, work in fields which are adjacent to ours, which can really enrich the student experience and sort of enrich the curriculum for us. So we know we can't do everything, and nor I think should we try to, because I think following really a sort of ecological network model, having that distributed focus and having other areas of expertise that then can help support our, whether it's faculty, research, or student experience, is really paramount and sort of key to that model.
There's so many aspects of what you mentioned there that are unfortunately rare in many people's educational experience. Having a small enough class size to be able to nurture a relationship with the person who is guiding your educational experience, whether that's a teacher or some other type of facilitator, having the facilities or the opportunity to put concepts and theory into practice out in the field. And many of the others that you mentioned, where do you feel like you kind of get the most mileage when those are present, even if not all of them are present at once?
Oh, interesting. I'd say that at our core, right, we went through a pretty significant curriculum regeneration, as we've described it over the past year here at Prescott. And part of the sort of beginning of that process was to work with the faculty and have us really all agree on what is it that Prescott does. What have we done for now almost 60 years? Next year is our 60th anniversary. And it came down to everything we do is at the intersection of four things: leadership, education, human systems, and ecology, right? Every program that we run, whether it's a licensure counseling program, education leadership masters, or undergraduate certificate in sustainable food systems, or a regenerative design MA, all of those things are on that matrix, right? And one, like, be sort of really being true to that foundation and saying that that represents a real sort of transdisciplinary focus, that we are looking at, I know a lot of universities are fond of saying we work with real world problems and give you the experience to solve those problems. I mean, we really do put our students in the positions where they're affecting meaningful change, and whether that's in our social justice programs or what have you, right? And I think it's really the core of the experience, which is at the center of that intersection of those four things, that I haven't seen effectively replicated anywhere else, right? I mean, we may say that we've got, an undergraduate and graduate programs in social justice and community organizing, which we do, but it's not just that they're siloed as separate programs. That's a core value of everything that we do. So if you're in adventure education or environmental studies, you're having a similar engagement, whether it's through a formal concentration or actually just engaging in those conversations, right? That will enhance your education in ways that if you have a degree in department X somewhere, that you wouldn't necessarily be getting. Right. So it's experience in engaging with community partners, literally working in the gardens on campus or working at our Butte Creek Restoration Project or, whatever, or it's experience across the different disciplines that opens up whole different ways of thinking for a lot of our students. And I also see that in some of the research projects that, arise when faculty work across those departments.
And you said you recently had overhaul or regeneration of the curriculum at Prescott. Can you tell me about what that process looked like?
Yeah, well, again, we started, with a few weeks, actually, started in May, I think, of last year, of grounding ourselves in what the, 60-year history was of Prescott College, right? And then what are the key elements of that remain core, and whether they're, some core, programs that we, are continuing, right? Or, doubling down and making more robust, or whether those are, some of these thematic elements that we are actually really focused on the intersection of human and more than human systems in ways that are authentic. So we don't study them in a vacuum, but we actually look at, I think the creek restoration, there's a creek called Butte Creek, which runs through the middle of campus. That's actually been dry for months and months now, since we haven't had rain since October. But, that's a restoration project that, involves the whole of the community and is visible in the center of campus, brings community members from off of campus during sort of Arbor Day tree planting activities, and actually will serve as a model for other creek restorations in the community, right? So that as sort of a core visible element of the human, more than human engagement. And we're sit right here. You can probably hear traffic noise in the background, right? We are in the middle of Prescott, at a town of 40,000 people. We're not somewhere, off on a campus away from the community. We are embedded within the community. And so I think that in and of itself, and it's an open campus, so in and of itself is a testament to our engagement with, our human neighbors as well as our more than human ones. And I think the visibility of that, particularly for students who are able to visit and kind of to see, what the situatedness of the campus and how it engages in those conversations itself, I think it is really powerful.
And so how do we start to work the concepts that you've mentioned into an existing curriculum? We can even use me for an example, right? So I teach watershed restoration and all kinds of different water management courses. What would you ask a person like myself in order to get insights into how a curriculum or how an event might be improved or optimized when we're looking to create local community engagement, when we're really trying to spark something in the participants and get them inspired about these concepts beyond just the theory of what we're doing?
Well, I mean, I think you've got an advantage on me because I don't really have the sort of depth of knowledge about, the course and its, context and that sort of thing, right? But I would start with the outcomes. And I think, again, there is a sort of scalability to a regenerative learning framework that's really important. That, it's entirely possible to take one course like the one that you're describing and say, well, I'm going to add these elements or integrate, a community partnership because, I, Oliver, have this relationship with this, farm or business or, sort of ecological expert in the community, and we can bring them in or take our students out into the field, and that's fantastic. And I think that's a great place to start. But contextually for me, what are the other layers? Is there a layer of sort of departmental validation of that? Is that an integrated program learning outcome from the program? Is that something that the department aspires to? Is it supported through research funding? Is it supported through institutional resources? And is it, in fact, actually modeling some of the participatory governance models, that the organization itself engages in, right? So is it nested within a structure that is itself regenerative and sort of building on that resilient model, or is it, similarly the valid way, right, trying to make inroads on an individual course basis, by supporting students in that kind of learning, right? So those would be my first sort of questions, is how we can, thread those different elements of scale together so that the course and that sort of approach are more institutionally supported.
I think those are perfect questions to broaden the possibilities of curriculums with things that maybe don't necessarily seem like they connect with the whole world around it or the whole community around it. But definitely in my experience, working with water at any level goes all the way through the water catchment area, the communities involved in it, the industries, and the way that people make their living, because all of it uses water at some point. It's a very all-encompassing thing. And I love those insights and all of the opportunities to include and engage people who maybe don't see themselves directly in the actual implementation of a project or the installation of a feature or something, but recognizing that they all play a role in some aspect of water management, even just by being a consumer.
Yeah, exactly. So if, the infrastructure of the institution that you're part of, what is its engagement with water systems, right? Are there particular initiatives in sort of water catchment or water conservation or, any other sorts of things? And, certainly here being here in Arizona, that's something which is, at the forefront of our thinking almost every day.
Yeah, it's also very important here in northeastern Spain, in Catalonia, where I'm, and we've been going through drought cycles recently. It's very much at the forefront of the news cycles as well. And it's an interesting time because everybody has an opinion on this stuff, of course, and everybody has ideas about how things should be managed, and it becomes political very quickly. Yeah, but anyway, so to step back a little bit from my example, I'm also really curious to hear about some examples of, let's say, curriculum or engaging teachers that really stand out in your mind. Maybe you can give me some examples from a class that you've either taken or helped to curate that really exemplify some of the biggest potential of a regenerative curriculum or course?
Mm. All right, well, let me give you two examples. One here recently at Prescott, and then one from Schumacher College, where I was just previously. And let's start with the second one, just chronologically, that makes sense. So whilst I was, head of Schumacher, I was also developing programs. We, grew the curriculum considerably in the, almost 5 years that I was there. And one of the sort of new master's programs that we developed was an MA in movement, mind, and ecology. And that was born in the midst of COVID. So I arrived there in October of 2019, and in March of 2020 had one of my first actions was to close the campus, because of the COVID pandemic. During that time, I actually was thinking about how to take my experience. And so, my parallel world is as an endurance athlete, and particularly long distance endurance running and engaging in Arctic and subarctic landscapes in sort of conversation with the more than human world around climate change. And, so how to sort of take some of that and integrate it into a world where suddenly, in England, we had 1 hour that we were allowed to spend outside per day, for a period of time during 2020. And, so how to think about, whatever people have access to, whether it's actually just a half-hour walk along the hedgerow in your village, or out into the fields or into an urban park if it was open, how we can sort of take those moments and explore the sort of alive space between the human and the more than human, so that we can then potentially shift our individual perspectives and then maybe slightly nudge the narrative around human relationships with the natural world in terms of climate change. Right. So I thought, how can we manifest this in an accessible, format in a program where we brought together these three threads of movement. So movement practice, whether that's dance or yoga or endurance running or whatever it is, and ecological thinking. So looking at systems thinking and sort of models of resilience and adaptation, and then humanities and environmental philosophy as a framework for that, and sort of thinking about sort of the philosophical as well as the practical elements. And it was a really successful program that, I worked with we hired a program lead and some faculty, and Dr. Rachel Sweeney was program lead on that. And, she brought it into a space where there was a huge diversity of students coming on board. And again, low residency program where diversity of movement practices coming together as a way to really have an embodied engagement with the more than human world that then could help those students build a skill set where they could facilitate those same sort of practices with community. So the fourth module of the program was really a public-facing module where the students were charged with, all right, take what you've learned in modules 1 through 3 and do this with a community group, and therefore try to multiply the impact that we were having as educators, and then give the students that set of skills, right? And this was based on all sorts of feedback from community groups, from outdoor guides, from outdoor recreation folks, from sort of environmental thinkers and so on, to help, what do we need in the world for our students to have these skills to be able to actually shift our conversation. And so we used embodied practice in the more than human world as a tool to do that. And I think the integration of those three threads, particularly with a practice-led curriculum, really led the course not just to model kind of a regenerative learning space, but actually to multiply its impact, and share with community members aspects of resilience and adaptation and sort of reflection and regeneration and sort of all of these sort of holistic thinking models through community movement practice, right? So I think that for me, that's one of the more successful models that I've been part of building, right?
Yeah, that's really beautiful.
And then the second example here, I actually just last week, I spent several days at one of our field campuses. So we have 2 field campuses in addition to a host of global partners. One is about 12-hour drive south of here in Quino Bay, Mexico. So on the Gulf of California on the Mexican side. And then we have another in South Kenya in Maasai Land called the Depoi Center. So this one, where I was most recently in Quino Bay, the Quino Bay Center, I was there as part of a PhD student retreat. So we have a PhD program in sustainability education, and that program hosted a retreat for, an optional retreat for a number of students at the Quino Bay Center. And none of those students were studying whether it's the community ecology or marine ecology, or there's an integration of those things that the center does really, really well. But all of them came away with sort of touchstones from that experience, right? That they could integrate into their PhD work, whatever state that they were in, whether they were doing conservation work toward net zero carbon in Massachusetts in the Northeast, whether they're working in Florida or New York or elsewhere around the country or the world. They saw this particular type of experience, and so over the 3 days we engaged with both. There are about 20, 25 staff at the center. So all of whom are engaged both in teaching and in research. So their research focuses on the integration of the native concat communities and the marine ecosystem there, the Mexican national community with, again, some of the ecological challenges around, so the coastal communities, the fishery. So there's a real integration with the community and the staff at the center and the students from Prescott College and the much more than, huge, more than human world, right? Part of the experience was, for all of the students was going out into the Kino Bay and, having close encounters with whales, with fin whales, with dolphins, with, sort of the richness and sort of abundant wildlife, whilst seeing the impact that fisheries were having, that the fishery industry is having on the marine life there. And I think probably similarly to, maybe some of the coastal experiences in Catalonia where you are, right? I think the engagement of marine conservation with the pressure of fishery, with the local communities and their sort of historic relationship with those more than human spaces. So for me, it was really inspiring to see the intersection of all those different layers, right, within a short period of time, a 1-week intensive residency, to have students coming from all over the place who are studying very different things, but also seeing, okay, this model of intersecting native communities with local businesses, with research, with arts, with the more than human world in sort of a deep, deep way resonated with them such that I think it's going to have an impact on their overall dissertation work, right? So really, for me, that's an exemplary model of what experiential learning can do, even if it's not, directly focused on, this is my research question, let's study that. But actually the type of engagement, the type of pedagogy and type of experience, that for me was really meaningful to see the students respond to that.
That's really beautiful. And, you're talking about experiential learning. I've heard other terms thrown around as participatory learning or co-creation of learning experiences. It seems to come down to a curated opportunity to learn through lived experience and the challenges that come up in something that is particular to an area in which someone wants to develop or grow, while the necessary resources are given in order for them to find unique solutions or to problem solve in real time as they move through that challenge. And there are so many different opportunities these days to engage with these types of opportunities. Goodness knows there are challenges that face communities all around the world. And the fact that you have these campuses in different places, I can only imagine how valuable that is for students to be able to, maybe go out of their comfort zone, learn to solve problems when there are many layers of challenges stacked on top of each other, let's say language barriers or cultural barriers, different access to resources. I've had the pleasure and the challenge of going through this many different times in many different countries myself. I can attest to how transformative it can be to later feel that you can be competent and to excel despite these challenges. And it really gives a sense of empowerment to take on new things and enrich or deepen the relationships that come from this. What have been some of your major takeaways in observing this while guiding other students with it or participating in it yourself? Like, from what you've seen or observed in these events, what are you trying to build on more of, or perhaps reduce based on things that did or did not work?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a really long answer to that question. I think I could write a paper about that, right? And probably have. Yeah. But I think, it to me, it boils down to a few things, right? And one of which is, what I see develop. Well, one, I think it really explores and challenges students' paradigms, right? If they coming in with a research question as a PhD student, right, I think the reason that they may have resonated with the experience is because it challenges the very notion of, what is a research, what is this research question that I'm working with? Because clearly there are other ways of knowing and other ways of perceiving and framing the world that are not necessarily, that the students may not be engaging with explicitly, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they're put in a different circumstance, a different cultural, linguistic context, a different, different ecological context, a different economic, like everything. Say, great, well, I can't do this research question the same way here, right? So what does that mean in terms of, making it more universal or actually engaging with a diversity of knowledges, whether that's, local ecological or indigenous ecological knowledges or, indigenous ways of knowing, to really integrate those into, that sort of research methodology. Right. So for one, it's really expanding any preconceptions I think that a student might have. And that's not just at the PhD level, right? It's certainly, students coming in as undergraduates or in our master's programs, it's a similar experience. If you can be sort of, as you said, taken out of your comfort zone. But I think, ultimately that's engaging with, as we've scaffolded those experiences, right, with community partners of a diversity of community partners that can then help you sort of explore and expand your research questions or your the way that you approach learning in general, right? So I think that's one, and the core of that really is about relationships. I've been writing a fair bit, working on a project now around democracy, ecology, and education, and how those three interweave. And to me, experiential learning is built on students' relationship, whether it's relationship with a more than human or with community partners through internships or service learning or whatever that might be. So this core of relationality, if we think about, learning as a network, then really it's less about the nodes on the network and more about the connectivity and the relationship, right? So those are the things that I want to make sure that are fostered, right? Because I think as we see sort of waning trust in democratic institutions, particularly in this country, but also elsewhere around the world, a lot of that seems to be a lack of relationship, between individuals, between communities that might have slight differences, but those differences are being concretized, by larger institutions and really weaponized. And so I think building those relationships between individuals, communities across cultures, languages, et cetera, is fundamental to reestablishing that trust.
Well, let's dig deeper into that on how to establish that trust and maybe some examples of educators who you feel exemplify some of the better aspects of regenerative education. I know in some of the examples that you gave previously, there's a whole group facilitating the experience and the learning. So maybe this isn't just on an individual basis, but what are some of the qualities and attributes of really effective educators in this way of facilitating learning for others?
Wow. I think that's again a great question. And I think that comes in some ways from, what's the experience that you've had? And I think that's part of where we're challenged right now. Because, we're doing our part by having a PhD program in sustainability education that really focuses on sort of experiential learning, practice-led learning, equity, sustainability, et cetera, right? And I think those kinds of programs that actually, train teachers at the post-secondary level. So I'm talking about higher education specifically here, that train, people to be professors or facilitators in that space. It's a fairly small group at the moment, right? And I think, because largely the sort of academic pathway is toward more traditional still sort of department-focused higher education frameworks, right? So I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of actually creating pathways for training for students so that they can become professionals in that field, actually become, have facility with these types of, with this pedagogy and these types of experiences, right? So I think, that's part of the challenge that we're trying to address here. And it's what we were trying to do at Schumacher as well with the graduate programs. And so I think, having a, fundamental to this really is having a holistic view of, what education is. And, as we talked about, earlier, what's the sort of institutional framework that you're working within? And does it actually give you the capacity to do those sorts of things, right? So like what institution would enable you to have a 21-day, wilderness orientation for, your incoming undergraduate students? Or, where could you have a 1 week or even just a few days residency to focus on, integrating community practices and experiential learning? We're having a social justice immersive residency here at Prescott at the end of February, the beginning of March, which is bringing together graduate students, undergraduate students, community partners, alumni, and so on, to really focus on, current to the day questions of, social and community justice and organizing, right? So I think, it's going sort of circumambulating your question a little bit in terms of like, what is the list of things that I think, an instructor needs to have? I think there is a skill set, but I think the foundation of that skill set is really, looking at whatever educational paradigm you're in systemically and holistically, and thinking about, all right, how can I reach across, departmental lines, or how can I, work with partners outside the sort of traditional, academic framework that actually might challenge some of the paradigms within that. And I think there's some models, whether it's working with gardens or whether it's working with community organization groups or, community education groups, or, down in Mexico, you're working with fishermen and working, with conservation experts in the community. It's really broadening the reach. And again, as I talked about before, sort of thinking about relationality and what is the strength of the relationship you can build, between just you in the classroom and what's happening out in the world outside academia.
Yeah, and man, there's a lot of follow-up questions, because I'm working on trying to develop myself as a better educator, and I really see the role as something, first of all, of pretty high responsibility.
Yeah.
But at the same time, a lot of my previous references to the more conventional educational system are not particularly what I want to emulate.
Yeah.
And I also find myself in situations where I am teaching to students who are my same age or older, and there's a different dynamic there. I often get I start to feel inadequate. I start to get the imposter syndrome, certainly, when I'm working with people who have a lot more life experience than I do in other areas. Have you come up against this yourself? Is this something that you've had to overcome?
Well, I'll say, Oliver, that never goes away.
I feel much better now.
I don't know if that's reassuring or not, but I think if that wasn't the case, I don't think we'd be doing our jobs well, right? Because even as we talked about, let's scaffold spaces where students are outside their comfort zone. I think we need to do the same thing, because effectively what we're doing as educators is modeling that type of behavior. So if you're sort of set in your paradigm, you've been teaching the same course for, 10 years and you haven't changed any of the textbooks or anything like that, what does that say to the students in terms of, are we growing as individuals in our field? Are we personally having those relationships, with, community partners that we can then model for those students and actually, help those students build those same relationships? I think that naturally puts at least me, right, in situations where, like, oh, right, am I an imposter in this space, right? How did I get to be in this position? How am I having this conversation where I know most likely the other person's thinking the same thing, right? So, right, I think it's totally fine and natural to have that. I think if we profess to be experts in something, then I think we have a lot to learn.
Right. And I have moved away from that since quite a while ago and started to see my role more as a coach. Yep. Or someone who is helping to guide another person through an experience in order to get the most out of it, and yep, to, give some pushes and nudges in directions that they might not have thought before, to go deeper into the subject or look at it from perspectives that perhaps they hadn't considered, and yep, to illuminate a path that they ultimately take themselves. Now, that's yep, a tall order for what is sometimes maybe a handful of hours or just a couple of days of an event or a course. Have you found, or maybe even could recommend, some icebreakers or some techniques that help to build that kind of trust and relationship that then open up a sense of ease, or I guess trust, of asking questions or exploring things? And oftentimes it's the sensitive subjects or the more interpersonal aspects of even something somewhat neutral, like water management, like we talked about before, but like I also work a lot with farmers who bring a lot of their personal experience and their anxieties of maybe struggling to make the business work or trying to overcome some big hurdle, whether that be economic or climate related or otherwise. It can get personal very fast, and so building that relationship, that trust is key, like you've already talked about. Do you have some advice on how to, I don't know, facilitate that in the beginning in order to grease the wheels as you start to move towards a shared outcome?
Yeah, well, I think trust goes in every direction, right? It isn't so much like, oh, the students have to trust us or have to trust the institution, which I think they're always wary of doing, right? But I think that again is modeled through our trust of the students, right? So, there's a balance between, like, we all have sort of learning outcomes and objectives that I think are both legitimate and important, as well as sort of a manifestation of the sort of educational paradigm that we're in, right? That we're accredited and we need to meet these certain goals. But within that, I think there's huge flexibility in terms of how we ask students to engage with some of the questions that we're posing, in and outside the classroom. One of the reasons that I really love the learning community model is that it breaks open the walls of the classroom and actually says, all right, well, particularly if you're in a low residency model or if you're a fully residential student, right, which these days is becoming increasingly rare, then you have those spaces outside the confines of, your 55 minutes with Oliver, right, to go and, work alongside a student in the gardens or work alongside you, maybe, in some task around campus where the learning actually extends itself. And for me, it's through some of those engagements that trust can really be sort of solidified among community. So doing practices that are not just within the classroom, but if you've got the capacity, and I know that not every institution has the sort of framework to allow that sort of thing, right? But if that's possible, right, I think that the ultimate version of that is, what I experienced at Schumacher, where you've got entire master's programs going out in the rain into the gardens, weeding so that they know that they're going to have food that they may not eat, but that the next cohort of students may eat. There were projects there where the students knew they were planting a field of flax, for the incoming class to use in an engaged ecology project. Right. So there are these sort of trusts even across cohorts that don't know one another that are built through an engagement with the more than human world. Right. So I think using that as a space to create that engagement and trust, but also I think if you're within a bit more of a sort of traditional or, confined framework where those things aren't necessarily possible, and even an online framework, right, is, going back to Freire, right, sort of what's the problem posing framework that we might be able to use, right? And so I've been using sort of practice-led learning in tandem with experiential education, because I think practice-led is, all right, let's do this thing, and then let's reflect on how that thing actually connects to some of the outcomes or connects to some of the intellectual or theoretical framing that we're talking about. I think that's entirely feasible to do in an online space where you present a problem or a challenge for students to engage with on an embodied, practical, individual level, and then come back and share that experience. So I think it's the sharing of experience, that the students have had that can also build that trust and capacity. Because if we go back to the sort of paradigm of relationality, then it is the sharing of sort of individual experiences that then helps to create that community. Because if we're just students and we're just engaged in, whatever the subject matter is, without connecting it to your own positionality, to your own context, to your own framing, then I think we'll be doing the students and the idea of learning community a disservice.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned the opportunity of doing some of these things through online resources, because that was the other part I wanted to explore with you. It seems that now that everybody has pretty easy access to the internet, more and more educational experiences are being moved online, from webinars to online courses and such. And I'm already starting to feel like there's an over-reliance due to the convenience of online resources to put more and more of our education onto that space.
Mhm.
Where do you feel like Well, technology is perhaps being overused and is not appropriate for the real learning journey that has a bigger potential with this experiential learning that we talked about. And also, where do you see that there is potential that is perhaps being untapped with digital resources?
Yeah, I think, since about 70% of our classes are remote here at Prescott College. And at Schumacher College, we shifted from a fully residential master's model to a low residency one, where we again shifted probably 60 or 70% of the students' engagement to online, and then 30 to 40 on site. And we did that for a number of reasons. And I think there are entirely legitimate and I think good reasons for integrating remote and low residency learning. I'm a big fan of the low residency model because you are able to bring cohorts together sort of physically and do things that are very difficult to do in an online space when people are separated. And some of that is eating together and building that sense of community and doing collaborative projects in ways that it's hard to do at a distance. I think remote education allows a greater diversity of students potentially to access education. So they may not be able to travel to a campus, but might be able to engage in an online space. And again, there isn't universal access, of course, to the internet or to online courses, and there are still tuition barriers. But I think there are, particularly for students who have families or who have jobs that are unable to take significant time out of their lives to be in a residential program, it makes a lot of sense, right? If we can then couple that with ways to create access for those students to residential experiences, like the one we had in Mexico with the PhD students, for example, who are online for most of their time, I think that's really powerful. Some really positive experiences I've had with, remote learning are when you actually have a pretty significant, diverse, international or geographically distributed cohort of students who are able to have experiential or embodied practices or practices with the more than human world in very different contexts. And then they can all bring those together in a group setting. And then suddenly, instead of having, 15 students who are sitting in a circle under a tree in your campus, you've got 15 students who might be, and these are examples from my own experience, in New Zealand and Nepal and South Africa and North America and Canada and United States and Canada, all at the same time. Time zones are a little strange, but there you've got not just different cultural contexts, different linguistic contexts, economic ones, but also different seasons, talking about, north and south of the equator. So, I have had experiences where, in England, we would, take the students out to do some event mapping in the woodland and maybe do a short jog or a hike through the woods. And all of the students that were online did the same thing where they were. And because of connectivity, we were able to, circle up in the woods with these students remotely, and they would share, oh, well, here's what the ocean front in the winter looks like in South Africa where I am, and here's what the summertime is in Devon in England, and then here's what my space is in Nepal, right? And that creates such a depth of experience because, again, it challenges students' paradigms to make assumptions of, oh, it's summer, for example, right? Or,
Or even that summer looks like one thing, right?
Exactly. Or maybe people don't have the same access, right, that other people might, right? So I think it does challenge some of those things. So I think it can really enrich the student experience in that sort of low residency model, as well as in terms of accessibility. And one of the things that it creates opportunities, or I think challenges too, for administrators, right, and for faculty is how can you continue to foster those experiential opportunities for students who don't regularly come to campus? And so we're trying to do that both through partnerships, right? So we can create hubs where students can go to elsewhere. It might be easier for somebody to go to Kenya than it might be to come to Arizona. So we could go there. And now we're working with, some partner universities across Europe and Southeast Asia and elsewhere to create these hubs where students can actually go to. Or, is it a one-to-one? Are you partnering with a business or a community group where you are so you can have those same experiences? Right. So that creates a sort of organizational challenge, but also creates a richness that you wouldn't have otherwise.
I'm so encouraged to hear that you guys do the same thing. It's kind of the challenge that I work with in moderating the climate farmers community here in Europe is that, of course, we have farmers all over a very broad and very diverse continent. And it's very convenient to have access to digital tools in order to stay in touch, to share pictures, to share stories. And the convenience is great, but there's a huge barrier in relationship building when you often don't see a face on the other side or don't really understand the context where they're coming from. And this is why we make such an effort to do these community gatherings. In fact, just last week, we finished doing one in Portugal. And it really does make a difference when you understand get a chance to meet the person who's on the other side of those text messages or some of those videos. And yeah, to me, some sort of mixture of the two is necessary in order to, first of all, build relationships and understand, to get a chance to talk outside of the barriers of these communication devices, but then the convenience as well to stay in touch when it's not convenient to meet in person. And we're always trying to navigate the conveniences and the limitations of those tools, but it's very cool to see you guys are doing this similar thing. Yeah, I'm curious where you see the evolution of education going because of access to these new tools. I mean, as it becomes more convenient and affordable to stay in education in some form or another, whether that be formal education in a university or constantly learning through workshops and different forms of development in other ways, it seems like increasingly people are becoming lifelong learners, which is fantastic.
Yep.
And where do you think the potential is there? Do you think it's going to become more decentralized or perhaps take a different trajectory?
Yeah, I think that's really where a lot of my professional work is focused. So I'm happy that you asked that question. I think I think we talked about earlier, I think that the existing higher educational paradigm is pretty much broken, right? From many different perspectives, right? There's a reason that colleges are closing. There's prohibitive expenses, particularly here in the US, where tuitions are astronomical. And put students into debt for decades following their graduation, and all sorts of barriers to access, and I think barriers to diversity of types of education exist, right? So, I mean, to our previous conversation, this type of online education, that we're having now, right? The conversation, I think, is just the very beginning of what technology might be able to sort of help us with, right, in order to actually facilitate more meaningful experiences, with and for students, right? So I think we very quickly, particularly with COVID, very quickly shifted to, okay, whether we'll do Zoom lectures or whether we'll just sort of try to replicate a classroom experience online in an asynchronous or a synchronous way, or however universities choose to do that. I think that's just the very first tiny step of what's possible, right? And I can't predict exactly what's going to happen, but I think that the more that educational futurists and educational professionals get into that space and actually, do innovation around, what are the technologies that are actually going to be useful? Because, lecturing really isn't as useful as it used to be, particularly with the access to information, with AI coming on board. There are all sorts of really interesting conversations, some of which I'm a part of, are like, well, how do we then both preserve or evolve what experiential and practice-led learning are and can be within the context of this sort of hybrid or online space, right? So what innovations might we want to make? And again, I don't have solutions to that, right? But for me, those are open questions, and I know that there is more to come, right? I also think that replicating the paradigm of the 3 or 4 year undergraduate degree and the unified master's program, that has also may have a finite lifespan. That I think there are sort of questions around, in this country particularly, there's been a significant decline in sort of the trust in, what is higher education actually good for? What does it get you? And I think, we're being asked more and more to tie undergraduate learning outcomes to and graduate learning outcomes to salary. I think that was also beginning to be the case in the UK. I'm not sure if in the EU, but to actually be able to justify the expense of the education based on what potential earnings the student might have post-graduation, right? And for me, that is one metric. That's not necessarily the one that's core to my sort of pedagogical belief system and sort of structure we've been talking about here. So I think there are ways to actually further distribute, and there's what learning is, and whether that's through micro-credentialing, whether that's through stacking the individual modules that students take so that they can build their own degrees within the context of a higher education framework. So, here are 40 different modules. What pathway might you be able to create for yourself, right? And I think there are sort of increased flexibility with more asynchronous engagement, right? So how do we pair asynchronous engagement with a curriculum in a stackable micro-credential context with experiential learning, right? So for me, that's the question that right now I'm looking to find some answers to. And I think some of the work that we're doing in terms of low residency and immersive experiences for our online students, that's one element of that. I think the next will be, how can we make, what is maybe a 2-year master's program accessible to students who may not have 2 years or who might want to enter in the middle of that or focus on a particular module or two. So really exploring the opportunities of micro-credentials and the opportunities of stackable modules. So I think there is additional flexibility coming. I don't think that's a bad thing. And, as I'm sort of describing that, it might sound to you and to listeners like, is that antithetical to building a learning community and to building trust, right? And I think absolutely not. But we do need to find, what the bridges are so we can both create these educational experiences, but not as necessarily discrete commodities for students, but as entry points into a larger conversation with community, with learning networks and partners.
I want to quickly go back to one thing that you mentioned there about not making the salary pegged to a degree, a single metric that you determine whether or not it's worth the investment on. What other metrics would you suggest people think about when they're considering how to advance their learning journey?
Well, I think different students or different participants may have sort of a different framework, right, coming in. And, I think we need to have some flexibility around what those metrics are, right? And the reason that I sort of chafe a little bit at that particular one, which is really the only one that some people seem to care about, it lends itself to, a subset of educational experiences and higher ed programs that may not include things like the arts, for instance, may not include things that, it takes time to build up skills and reputation and potential, earnings post-graduation, and, don't lend themselves immediately to, 6-figure salary, if you're a musician or an artist, or, if you're working as a field ecologist, for example, or if you're working in any one of these industries that, may not be immediately STEM related, may not get you into the tech sector, which, I think by and large, if I look at what are the degree programs that students are most interested in and drawn to, it is those sorts of programs that drive people into the technology sector, which is an important sector. It's not one that we service here at Prescott College, nor at Schumacher, nor at Sterling. So it's not necessarily my focus. So if I was to, create opportunities for students to help shape their own sort of outcomes and metrics, it would be, what is my level of community impact? And what is my sort of level of community engagement? How many people or how many organizations have I as a student, or can I as a graduate engage with and make their lives, better in some way, right? And what sort of meaningful engagement can I have? What is my impact on the more than human world? What is my ecological impact going to be as a result of this study, right? Am I going to have a more regenerative, resilient relationship with the more than human world? Or am I going to have one that actually segments me off from that and focuses much more on an anthropocentric human worldview, right? So for me, those are some really important metrics which aren't necessarily explicitly, being used to sort of measure the effectiveness of higher education programs. I think, there are some really interesting initiatives out there in the world, such as, I think there's one in the UK, Nature on Board, like how to bring nature onto trustee boards, right? Which then would actually help to oversee some of the decisions of an organization. And I think there are similar types of programs that are trying to create different types of metrics.
I really like the questions that came up there, and I think not only should they be more considered in other disciplines like the tech sector, which you mentioned, but are good to ruminate on for making most life decisions, whether it's specifically advancing your education or not. Look, Pavel, this has been really insightful for me, and I've already gotten tons of nuggets that I look forward to unpacking and exploring more as I continue on my own education journey and try and develop more as an educator myself. Before you go, can you tell our audience how they can get in touch with you and explore some of the many resources that you have written on these very topics?
Yeah, absolutely. The easiest way right now is to go to prescott.edu, which is the Prescott College website. I'm in the directory. I have a list of some of the recent publications, a bio information there, as well as contact information. So yeah, I'd be happy if anybody wanted to reach out.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for engaging with me on the very specific and contextual questions that I posed to you. It was really, really fun. And I really hope that we can continue some sort of conversation about this, especially as I put some of these ideas into practice here where I live.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Oliver. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to continued conversation.
Now, before we wrap this up, just remember that these episodes are only the beginning of the learning resources, design and coaching services, in-person courses, and interactive community that are available through Regenerative Skills. The Discord server is our free community where you can connect with other like-minded listeners, exchange ideas, stories, tips, and resources, as well as interact with me directly and quite a few former guests from this show. Our Instagram account @regen_skills is the best place to see the projects that me and the team are working on, both for clients and collaborators, as well as on our own properties. I'll also be announcing the certification courses, workshops, and gatherings that we've got coming up later this year. If you're interested in getting dedicated support for your own project, you can now schedule a free planning session with one of our team members through the request form on our website. You can also find all the links, show notes, and past resources there at regenerativeskills.com. We truly believe that no matter your experience, your knowledge, abilities, resources, or background, you can be a powerful force for regeneration on this planet, and we're here to help you find your path. So as always, remember to keep taking those little steps every day towards a regenerative future, and I'll be right by your side along the way.